You are lying on a straw mattress in a freezing stone cottage in Yorkshire, England. In the winter of 1347, your husband's calloused hand finding yours beneath a rough wool blanket that reeks of unwashed bodies and livestock. But this moment of tenderness is shattered by the wet, rattling cough of your mother-in-law, who sleeps barely 3 feet away on her own pallet, her arthritic breathing creating a symphony of wheezes and groans that mingles with the snores of your 2 young children, the grunting of the pregnant sow in the corner, and the constant scratching of rats in the thatch above your head. This is intimacy in the medieval world, stolen moments between the snores of relatives, whispered endearments masked by the crackling of dying embers, and the nauseating awareness that every gesture, every touch, every breath is witnessed by someone whose proximity is so suffocating that you can smell the decay of their teeth and the stench of their unwashed flesh. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. The very concept would have been as foreign to a 14th century peasant as flying to the moon. The single-room dwelling where you lie was home to perhaps 8 or 10 people spanning 3 generations, their bodies pressed together in a space barely larger than a modern apartment bedroom, sharing not just the same air, but the same fleas, the same lice, the same diseases, and the same desperate need for warmth in a world where fuel was precious and death lurked in every draft. Your husband's elderly father occupies the place of honor nearest the hearth, his joints so swollen with arthritis that his groans punctuate every attempt to shift position, while the unmarried brother sleeps beside the door, ready to defend the household, his sword within arm's reach and his body blocking the only exit from his human warren. Yet somehow, within this suffocating maze of humanity, married couples found ways to express their love, to conceive children, to maintain the bonds that held families together through unimaginable hardship. The methods they developed were born of necessity, refined through generations of desperate ingenuity, and passed down through whispered instructions from mother to daughter, father to son, creating an underground network of techniques so intimate and shocking that they challenge everything we think we know about human sexuality and the history of romantic love. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The architecture of medieval homes reflected this nightmarish reality of communal existence. Even among the wealthy, the Great Hall served as the communal living space where the entire household gathered, ate, worked, and slept. The lord and lady might retreat to a solar, a private chamber, but even these rooms often housed multiple family members, with archaeological evidence from 13th century manor houses revealing that most bedchambers contained multiple beds, sometimes separated by nothing more than hanging tapestries that provided the illusion of privacy while muffling neither sound nor smell. In the peasant cottage, space was even more precious and horrifyingly constrained. The single room served as kitchen, workshop, dining hall, and bedroom, with the hearth providing the only source of heat and light, making it the natural gathering place for all activities, including the most intimate ones. The medieval understanding of the human body and its functions created a completely different framework for intimacy than anything we can imagine today. Medieval people lived in constant proximity to bodily functions that we consider deeply private. Defecation, urination, menstruation, childbirth, and sexual intercourse were all communal experiences witnessed by family members, servants, and guests. The idea that any of these natural functions should be hidden or conducted in private would have been incomprehensible to people who shared chamber pots, wiped themselves with communal rags, and considered the smell of human waste as natural and unremarkable as the scent of cooking food or livestock. Medieval society operated according to strict social hierarchies and codes of conduct that governed every aspect of daily life, including the most intimate moments between husband and wife. The church taught that sexual desire was sinful, to be indulged only within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation, creating a complex web of guilt and shame around the very acts necessary for survival and family continuation. Public displays of affection were frowned upon, and marital relations were expected to be conducted with discretion and modesty, which meant that couples had to develop elaborate systems of coded communication that could convey desire and intention without alerting the watchful eyes and ears of parents, siblings, servants, and children who shared their living space. These moral constraints created a nightmarish maze of unspoken rules and subtle communications that couples had to navigate while surrounded by witnesses. A married couple might signal their intentions through seemingly innocent gestures, a lingering touch when passing a cup of ale, a meaningful glance across the hearth, a whispered comment about checking the animals in the barn. These coded messages had to be interpreted correctly by the intended recipient while remaining completely invisible to parents who might disapprove, children who might gossip, and servants who might carry tales to neighbors or local authorities. The timing of intimate moments required careful choreography that would challenge even the most experienced theater director. Most households followed a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the demands of agricultural life. But within this structure, couples had to identify tiny windows of opportunity when the stars of family observation might briefly align. During harvest time, when everyone worked from dawn to dusk, exhaustion often trumped desire, leaving couples too depleted for anything more than the shared warmth of their bodies under rough blankets. Winter brought its own set of challenges. The cold that made undressing dangerous, the early darkness that compressed all activities into a few precious hours around the fire, and the close quarters that made every sound audible to sleeping family members whose ears had been trained by years of communal living to detect even the slightest unusual movement or whisper. The physical constraints of medieval intimacy were so extreme that they required techniques and adaptations that modern couples would find incomprehensible. Clothing served as both protection against the elements and a barrier to casual intimacy. Layers of wool and linen that were never fully removed, even during the most intimate moments, because complete nudity in the frigid temperatures of a medieval dwelling could literally kill you. Couples learned to navigate the complex architecture of medieval undergarments, developing techniques for partial disrobing that provided access while maintaining warmth, all while moving with the absolute minimum of motion and sound that might alert sleeping family members just feet away. The bed itself was a marvel of medieval engineering designed not for comfort or privacy, but for survival in the harshest possible conditions. The frame was built high off the ground to avoid drafts and rodents, creating a platform that served as both sleeping space and fortress against the dangers that lurked in the darkness below. The mattress was often little more than a sack filled with straw, feathers, or rags, covered with whatever fabric the family could afford, and shared by multiple family members whose bodies generated the warmth necessary for survival through the long winter nights. Multiple families often owned a single set of bed linens, washed perhaps once a month if water was available, creating an environment of shared bodily fluids and scents that would horrify modern sensibilities. The church bed curtains served multiple purposes beyond warmth and privacy, functioning as the most important piece of technology for intimate relationships in the medieval world. These heavy fabrics, often the most expensive item in a peasant household, created a psychological barrier that allowed couples to imagine themselves alone even when surrounded by family members. The curtains muffled sound and blocked sight lines, creating a cocoon of relative intimacy within the communal space, but they could not eliminate the awareness that parents, children, siblings, and servants were listening just feet away, their breathing and movements creating a constant reminder of the total absence of true privacy. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created natural patterns of intimacy that couples learned to exploit with the desperation of people whose survival depended on their ability to reproduce while maintaining family harmony. Winter nights were long and cold, making the shared warmth of the marriage bed a practical necessity as much as an emotional desire, But the extended periods of enforced proximity also created tension and irritation that could explode into violence if not carefully managed. Spring brought the renewal of life and energy after the hardships of winter, but also the return of agricultural work that left couples exhausted and separated by the demands of planting and animal husbandry. Summer offered opportunities for outdoor privacy that couples anticipated and planned for with the intensity of military strategists. The long days of agricultural work meant that couples might find themselves alone in the fields during the heat of midday, when others sought shade, creating precious moments of relative solitude that had to be seized despite the physical demands of farm labor and the constant threat of discovery by neighbors, children, or local authorities. The forest provided secluded spots for clandestine meetings, though these excursions carried enormous risks: bandits, wild animals, and the ever-present threat of discovery by community members who might report suspicious behavior to church or secular authorities. The church calendar imposed additional restrictions on intimate relations that created a complex system of permitted and forbidden times that couples had to memorize and navigate. The medieval Catholic Church designated numerous feast days, fast days, and periods of penance during which marital relations were forbidden, including Advent, Lent, and the weeks surrounding major religious holidays. Even within marriage, couples were expected to refrain from sexual activity on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, leaving only 4 days a week when intimacy was religiously sanctioned, and these restrictions were enforced through the confession system that required couples to report their violations to priests who might impose penance or public humiliation. Pregnancy brought its own set of challenges and opportunities that required careful navigation of medical ignorance and religious doctrine. Church teaching decreed that sexual relations should cease once a woman was visibly pregnant, and the period of purification after childbirth, typically 40 days, further restricted intimacy. Yet these same periods of enforced celibacy created anticipation and longing that intensified the eventual reunion, while also providing women with temporary relief from the constant pressure to conceive in societies where a woman's value was measured primarily by her ability to produce healthy children, particularly male heirs. The midwife played a crucial role in managing these intimate aspects of married life, serving as the only person in the community with detailed knowledge of female anatomy and reproductive cycles. Her advice on timing, positioning, and contraception was sought secretly by women who dared not discuss such matters openly, and her presence in the home during childbirth provided one of the few opportunities for frank discussions about marital intimacy, conducted in whispered conversations while the laboring woman's husband and male relatives waited anxiously outside, creating a temporary female space within the male-dominated household structure. Children presented perhaps the greatest challenge to marital privacy, as most medieval households included multiple generations sleeping in the same room well into adolescence. The concept of separate bedrooms for children was unknown except among the very wealthy, meaning that couples had to conduct their most intimate moments under the watchful eyes and ears of offspring whose innocence was both treasured and impossible to maintain. Young children were often oblivious to their parents' intimate moments, but older children posed a more delicate problem that required careful management and education. The solution was a complex system of willful ignorance and selective education that allowed families to function despite the total absence of privacy. Children learned to sleep deeply, to ignore certain sounds and movements, and to understand that some activities were strictly for adults, creating a form of psychological compartmentalization that allowed intimate relationships to exist within communal living spaces. Parents developed techniques for minimal movement and maximum silence, conducting their intimate lives in a space smaller than a whisper, their bodies learning to communicate through the slightest touch or pressure while maintaining the stillness of death. Medieval contraception, though officially condemned by the Church, was practiced throughout Europe through an underground network of feminine wisdom that operated in whispered conversations between mothers and daughters, midwives and patients. Women passed down knowledge of herbs and techniques that could prevent pregnancy or terminate early pregnancies, creating a parallel system of knowledge that challenged official religious doctrine while providing couples with some degree of control over their reproductive lives. These practices were dangerous both medically and legally, as discovery could result in accusations of witchcraft or heresy that carried the death penalty. The practice of bundling, which emerged in later medieval and early modern Europe before reaching its most developed form in colonial America, represents one of the most shocking and systematic approaches to managing intimacy within communal living spaces. This custom, brought to New England from Europe, allowed courting couples to sleep together in the same bed while fully clothed and sometimes separated by a bundling board or bound in bundling bags, creating a controlled environment for physical intimacy that maintained the appearance of propriety while acknowledging the reality of human sexual desire. Bundling was not merely a quaint folk custom, but a practical solution to the economic and social constraints of pre-industrial life. In colonial America, where fuel was expensive and houses were small, courting couples needed opportunities for extended conversation and physical closeness that were otherwise impossible to arrange. The practice allowed young people to spend entire nights together in conversation and limited physical contact while remaining under parental supervision, creating a socially acceptable framework for courtship that acknowledged both human desire and community standards of morality. The bundling board itself was a piece of wood, often hastily constructed from available materials, that was placed down the center of the bed to create a physical barrier between the courting couple. Sometimes the woman's legs were bound in a tightly fitting bundling stocking, or she was placed in a bundling bag that resembled a primitive sleeping bag, theoretically preventing any possibility of sexual intercourse while allowing for conversation, cuddling, and limited physical contact. The irony of this system was that it often created more intimate opportunities than conventional chaperone courtship, as couples spent entire nights together in bed, albeit with constraints. Records from colonial America reveal that bundling was far from foolproof as a method of maintaining chastity, with court documents and parish registers showing that 30 to 40% of American brides were pregnant at their weddings by the late 18th century. This high rate of premarital pregnancy was not necessarily seen as scandalous, as long as the couples married before the birth, reflecting a more pragmatic approach to sexuality that distinguished between committed relationships and casual encounters. Bundling actually served as a form of protection for young women, as the supervised nature of the practice provided witnesses to courtship that could be called upon in breach of promise cases if suitors proved unreliable. The economic realities of medieval and early modern life meant that many couples delayed marriage until their 20s or 30s when they had accumulated sufficient resources to establish their own households, creating years of sexual tension and desire that had to be carefully managed within the constraints of Christian morality and community surveillance. This delayed gratification created intense anticipation and longing that made the eventual consummation of marriage a moment of explosive relief and passion that had been building for years under the most difficult possible circumstances. Arranged marriages were the norm among all social classes, though the degree of family involvement varied based on wealth and social status. Even in arranged unions, couples were expected to develop affection and compatibility over time, and the intimacy that developed in these relationships was often deeper and more enduring than the passionate romances celebrated in medieval literature, precisely because it was forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual dependence under conditions that would destroy weaker bonds. The legal framework of medieval marriage gave husbands significant authority over their wives' bodies and behavior, with canon law requiring wives to submit to their husband's sexual demands while simultaneously restricting those demands to reasonable frequency and purpose. These contradictory expectations created tension and ambiguity that couples had to navigate privately, developing personal agreements and understandings that might differ significantly from official church teaching, while maintaining the appearance of conformity to religious and social expectations. The medieval understanding of female sexuality was heavily influenced by classical medical texts and Christian theology that portrayed women as naturally more lustful than men, requiring constant vigilance and control. Yet the same texts acknowledged that female pleasure was necessary for conception, creating a complex web of desire and guilt that permeated intimate relationships and required couples to balance religious doctrine with practical necessity and human emotion. The practice of communal sleeping arrangements extended far beyond the nuclear family to include servants, apprentices, guests, and travelers who might share beds and sleeping spaces for extended periods. This created complex dynamics of authority and intimacy that challenged conventional notions of appropriate behavior. As masters and servants, men and women, adults and children navigated physical proximity that would be considered inappropriate or illegal by modern standards. The development of separate bedchambers and private sleeping arrangements was a gradual process that occurred over several centuries, beginning with the wealthy and slowly filtering down to the middle classes as economic conditions improved and new technologies like chimneys and glass windows made it possible to heat and light multiple rooms. However, even among the wealthy, private bedrooms were not necessarily private, as servants routinely entered to tend fires, empty chamber pots, and assist with dressing and undressing, creating a different kind of intimacy that was based on class hierarchy rather than romantic attachment. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 fundamentally altered the dynamics of medieval households by creating massive population loss that meant surviving families often had more space and resources than their predecessors. The psychological impact of widespread death also changed attitudes toward pleasure and intimacy, as people sought comfort and connection in the face of mortality, leading to a temporary loosening of social constraints and an increased emphasis on seizing pleasure when it was available. Religious reform movements throughout the medieval period created additional pressures on intimate relationships by introducing new models of spiritual marriage and celibacy that challenged traditional notions of marital intimacy. Some couples attempted to live as spiritual siblings, renouncing physical relations while maintaining emotional bonds, creating relationships that were simultaneously more and less intimate than conventional marriage. The guild system that dominated medieval urban life created new patterns of household organization, where master craftsmen, their wives, journeymen, and apprentices often lived and worked in the same building, creating complex hierarchies of authority and intimacy. The master's wife might find herself responsible for managing the emotional and physical needs of young men far from their families, while maintaining appropriate boundaries and preserving her own marital relationship. The role of music and storytelling in medieval intimacy cannot be underestimated, as couples in a world without written entertainment often shared songs, poems, and stories as forms of emotional connection. The bardic tradition of romantic ballads provided a vocabulary for expressing feelings that might otherwise have remained unspoken, while the act of sharing stories created opportunities for couples to reveal their hopes, fears, and desires in ways that would have been impossible in ordinary conversation. The medieval kitchen, with its central hearth and communal cooking arrangements, was often the heart of household intimacy, where couples working together to prepare meals developed a wordless communication and physical coordination that translated into their private moments. The sharing of food, the management of cooking fires, and the complex logistics of feeding large households created opportunities for couples to demonstrate care and affection through practical service. The ritual of going to bed in a medieval household was a complex choreography involving multiple family members, with the order of retirement, the arrangement of bedding, and the careful management of the dying fire, all requiring coordination and understanding. Within this routine, couples had to find moments for private connection without disrupting the household's rhythm or attracting unwanted attention from family members whose survival depended on the smooth functioning of domestic arrangements. The seasonal celebrations of medieval life provided rare opportunities for community-wide relaxation of normal social constraints, with harvest festivals, religious holidays, and life cycle events featuring dancing, drinking, and ritualized courtship behaviors that allowed married couples to express their affection more openly than usual. These celebrations often created temporary inversions of social hierarchy that permitted behavior that would be scandalous under normal circumstances. The practice of pilgrimage offered medieval couples unique opportunities for privacy and intimacy that were impossible in their daily lives. The journey to holy sites often required weeks or months of travel, during which couples could experience a degree of freedom from family and community oversight that was otherwise unimaginable. The shared hardships of travel, sleeping under the stars, and facing dangers together created bonds of mutual dependence and shared experience that deepened intimate connections. The evolution of sleeping arrangements in colonial America reflected changing attitudes toward privacy and intimacy that emerged from the harsh realities of frontier life. The one-room cabins of early settlers gradually gave way to two-room houses and eventually to multi-room dwellings as economic conditions improved. But even these advances in housing did not necessarily provide privacy, as large families continued to share bedrooms and servants slept in the same rooms as their masters. The practice of putting guests and strangers in the same beds as family members was a common form of hospitality that created intimate situations between people who had never met before. Innkeepers routinely assigned multiple travelers to the same bed, and private homes welcomed visitors into family sleeping arrangements that could last for weeks or months during bad weather or extended visits. The development of courting customs in colonial America reflected a gradual shift toward greater individual autonomy in mate selection. But this freedom came with new challenges as young people had to navigate romantic relationships without the traditional constraints and protections of arranged marriage. The practice of bundling emerged as a compromise that acknowledged young people's desire for intimate relationships while maintaining parental supervision and community standards. The American Revolution created new opportunities for privacy and intimacy as traditional authority structures were challenged and new ideologies of individual freedom began to influence personal relationships. However, these changes occurred slowly and unevenly, with rural families continuing to live in communal arrangements well into the 19th century, while urban families began to adopt new standards of domestic privacy. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally transformed intimate relationships by creating new economic opportunities that allowed young people to establish independent households at earlier ages, while also creating new forms of urban crowding that replicated some of the challenges of medieval communal living. Factory workers and immigrants often lived in boarding houses and tenements, where privacy was as rare as it had been in medieval cottages. The Victorian era's emphasis on sexual modesty and domestic privacy represented a dramatic departure from earlier patterns of communal living and public intimacy. But this new standard was primarily available to the middle and upper classes who could afford separate bedrooms and domestic servants. Working-class families continued to live in crowded conditions that required many of the same adaptations and techniques that their medieval ancestors had developed. The technology of contraception evolved slowly from the herbal remedies and folk practices of medieval women to the mechanical devices and pharmaceutical interventions of the modern era. But the fundamental challenge of managing fertility within intimate relationships remained constant across centuries. Couples in every era had to balance their desire for physical intimacy with the practical constraints of supporting children in harsh economic circumstances. The persistence of communal sleeping arrangements in some cultures into the modern era demonstrates that the Western ideal of bedroom privacy is not universal or inevitable, but rather a specific historical development that reflects particular economic and social conditions. Japanese families practicing swan, Amish communities maintaining traditional bundling customs, and refugee families sharing single rooms all continue patterns of intimate adaptation that would have been familiar to medieval couples. The psychological impact of living without privacy created forms of intimacy that were simultaneously more and less intense than modern relationships, as couples learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded language, while also developing the ability to maintain emotional distance when physical space was impossible to achieve. The medieval couple sharing a bed with children, parents, and servants had to master forms of selective attention and emotional compartmentalization that modern couples rarely develop. The medical understanding of sexuality and reproduction evolved slowly from medieval theories of humors and conception to modern scientific knowledge. But couples in every era had to work with limited and often incorrect information about their own bodies and reproductive systems. The absence of reliable contraception meant that every intimate encounter carried the risk of pregnancy, making sexual relationships a constant negotiation between desire and practical consequences. The role of community surveillance in regulating intimate relationships created both constraints and protections for couples who had to balance their private desires with public expectations. The medieval practice of rough music, where communities organized public shaming of couples who violated social norms, created powerful incentives for maintaining appropriate behavior while also providing collective enforcement of marriage obligations. The economic dependence of women on marriage for survival meant that intimate relationships were always embedded within broader networks of property, inheritance, and social obligation that could not be separated from romantic or sexual attraction. Medieval couples had to navigate their personal desires within the context of family expectations, economic necessity, and community standards that often prioritized practical considerations over emotional fulfillment. The development of romantic love as an ideal rather than simply an emotion created new expectations and pressures for intimate relationships, while also providing new vocabularies for expressing affection and desire. The literature of courtly love offered couples models for passionate devotion that often conflicted with the practical realities of married life in crowded households. The persistence of traditional sleeping and intimacy patterns well into the modern era in many parts of the world demonstrates that the challenges faced by medieval couples were not unique to their time period, but represent ongoing human adaptations to economic constraint, social pressure, and physical limitation. Contemporary families dealing with housing shortages, economic hardship, or cultural traditions that prioritize extended family arrangements continue to develop many of the same strategies and techniques that couples used centuries ago. As you lie once again in that Yorkshire cottage in 1347, listening to the wind howl through the timber walls and feeling your husband's calloused hand find yours beneath the rough wool blanket, you understand something that centuries of privacy and prosperity have perhaps obscured. Intimacy was never about the space you possessed, but about the connection you created within whatever constraints surrounded you. Love was never about the silence you could purchase, but about the understanding you could build despite the noise of communal existence. In a world where privacy was impossible, couples discovered that true intimacy lived not in isolation, but in the choice to be tender despite witnesses, to whisper secrets that everyone could hear, but only lovers could understand, to find the sacred in utterly ordinary moments when two hearts beat close enough to share the same breath, the same hope, the same quiet defiance against a world that offered them everything except solitude. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, that was enough to sustain love across generations of hardship that would destroy relationships built on less substantial foundations. The techniques they developed, the compromises they made, and the love they created in the margins of communal life reveal something profound about human resilience and the power of intimate connection to survive and flourish under the most challenging possible circumstances. Their legacy is not the quaint customs recorded in history books, but the understanding that love, like survival itself, requires ingenuity, patience, and an acceptance of limitations that would seem impossible to modern sensibilities. The medieval world taught its inhabitants that intimacy, like everything else necessary for survival, was a skill to be learned and practiced under conditions of scarcity and constraint. The couples who mastered these skills created bonds that transcended the physical limitations of their circumstances, finding ways to nurture passion and affection within spaces that offered no privacy, no comfort, and no escape from the constant presence of others who share their struggles and witness their most vulnerable moments. Their intimacy was not the grand passion of romantic literature, but something far more precious and enduring, a quiet flame that burned steadily through the long nights of a world where privacy was a luxury few could afford, where love was a choice made new each day in the presence of witnesses who understood that some secrets were meant to be kept, some moments were meant to be shared, and some bonds were strong enough to survive anything the world could devise to test them. The stench of unwashed bodies, the constant coughing of the sick, the crying of children, and the snoring of relatives became not obstacles to love, but the very conditions within which love learned to flourish and endure.